The rain fell in relentless sheets over the neon-lit streets of Silver City, casting an almost ethereal glow that distorted the shapes of people, cars, and buildings alike. Through the haze and the glowing signs, a lone figure moved with purpose, blending in with the shadows yet keenly aware of every sound, every shift in the urban landscape. That figure was Jace Ramirez, a former Special Forces operative turned private investigator, haunted by a past that wouldn't let him go. Jace's life had spiraled into a chaotic blend of half-forgotten memories and sleepless nights since his last mission, a mission that had gone disastrously wrong. He had lost most of his team, but what haunted him most wasn't their deaths, it was the man responsible. A man he was here to find tonight. Rumor had it that his target, Viktor Volkov, had resurfaced in Silver City, allegedly plotting something big and devastating. Jace's old friend, Detective Harris, had tipped him off, his voice tinged with an urgency Jace had rarely heard. Harris, a seasoned detective in Silver City's police department, had been tracking Volkov's movements for months, and the information he provided was always valuable, albeit sometimes cryptic. The glowing sign above Jace read, "Trenton Hotel," though the lights flickered as if ready to give out any moment, much like the hotel itself. Abandoned years ago, the once luxurious building had turned into a hiding place for criminals, squatters, and other souls who preferred to stay out of sight. The roof leaked, graffiti marked the crumbling walls, and a chill seemed to hang in the air, even more bitter on a night like this. Jace exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. He checked the Glock strapped securely under his worn leather jacket, feeling its familiar weight and comfort. While many things in his life were unpredictable, this gun was a constant, a tool, a weapon, and sometimes, a lifeline. According to Harris's tip, Volkov was meeting someone tonight, a man known only as the Broker. Jace had encountered the name before. It was whispered among criminals, a shadowy figure rumored to orchestrate and fund operations from the darkest corners of the underworld. Anyone who had a score to settle or a need for cash would turn to the Broker, provided they had the connections and the nerve. Jace crouched in the shadows across the street, waiting, watching. Every few minutes, he could see movement through the hotel's broken windows. Then, at exactly 11 o'clock, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of the occupant inside. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face concealed beneath a dark hat and coat. Jace knew it had to be Volkov. Silently, he crossed the rain-soaked street, careful to stay hidden. He entered the hotel through a side entrance, slipping into the darkness and closing the door behind him. The interior was even worse than he'd imagined, walls covered in peeling wallpaper, floors littered with broken glass and trash. It smelled like mold and something else he couldn't quite place. But Jace wasn't here for ambience. The faint hum of voices floated from deeper within the hotel. Jace's pulse quickened. He recognized Volkov's voice, a deep, accented murmur tinged with impatience, and the Broker's calm, icy tone that could chill even the bravest of souls. They were talking business, something about final preparations and ensuring Ramirez doesn't leave here alive. The Broker's voice was almost mechanical, like a surgeon explaining a delicate procedure. There was no anger, no emotion, just a detached calculation that unnerved Jace more than Volkov's open hostility. "You'll receive the final payment once the job is done," the Broker was saying, his tone as smooth as silk. "But if he interferes, end him. I don't care how." Volkov's laughter echoed down the hallway. "Trust me, he won't make it out. Ramirez is already a dead man." Jace's hands tightened into fists. He had known that tonight was a trap, yet he couldn't resist the chance to face Volkov. There was no turning back now. He pressed forward, sticking to the shadows, but his silent approach was abruptly interrupted. A heavy hand suddenly clamped down on his shoulder, shoving him hard against the wall. He didn't have time to react as a burly figure loomed over him, a bodyguard, judging by his size and the determined scowl on his face. Jace twisted, breaking free with practiced precision and driving his elbow into the man's gut. The bodyguard grunted, staggering back, but Jace was already a step ahead. He brought his knee up sharply, hitting the man in the stomach before landing a swift, powerful strike to his jaw. The guard dropped to the floor, unconscious. But the noise had given him away. The murmur of voices stopped. A silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until Volkov's voice rang out. "Ramirez." Volkov called, his voice laced with mockery and a touch of anger. "Did you really think you could sneak up on me?" A shot rang out, the bullet narrowly missing Jace's head. He ducked and rolled, firing back instinctively, though he knew he was outmatched. Volkov was armed, and more than likely, he had backup on the way. Jace felt the pressure building, the need for a plan intensifying with each heartbeat. He'd faced worse odds before, but he couldn't help the nagging feeling that tonight was different. Volkov and the broker weren't just random criminals, they were part of something much bigger, something calculated and ruthless. As Volkov's men closed in, Jace weighed his options. The main hallway was out, too open. He scanned the surroundings quickly and noticed an old ventilation shaft partially concealed by debris. It was risky, but it could give him an edge. He darted toward the shaft, pulling himself inside just as bullets peppered the wall behind him. The cramped space forced him to move slowly, every inch forward demanding focus and discipline. He could hear Volkov's curses and the broker's cold reprimand echoing through the walls, their voices a twisted reminder of how close he was to being cornered. Finally, he emerged from the shaft, dropping down into what appeared to be an old ballroom. Dust hung heavy in the air, and shattered chandeliers dangled precariously from the ceiling. Jace surveyed the room, his instincts on high alert. This room was a dead end. He'd either have to make his stand here or find another escape route. He was scanning the walls when a figure appeared from the shadows. Detective Harris. For a moment, Jace felt a flicker of relief. Harris was one of the few people he could trust, or so he'd thought. "Harris?" Jace asked, lowering his gun slightly, though his gaze remained wary. "What are you doing here?" Harris looked worn and anxious, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. "I tried to warn you, Jace," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Volkov, he has my family. I didn't have a choice." Jace's pulse quickened, anger mixing with disbelief. "So you led me here. You betrayed me." Harris flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I had no other option, Jace. They said they'd kill my wife, my daughter. I had to play along." Jace's mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. Harris might have betrayed him, but he was still in danger. If Volkov was willing to threaten an innocent family, there was no limit to his ruthlessness. Before he could respond, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Volkov's men were closing in fast, and Jace knew they had only seconds before the entire room was swarming with armed thugs. "Listen," Jace said, his voice low and intense, "we don't have time for apologies. If we're going to make it out of here, we need to work together." Harris nodded, and they both turned toward the old staircase that led to the roof. It was a long shot, but with Volkov's men approaching, it was the only option left. They sprinted up the staircase, their footsteps echoing against the crumbling walls. Behind them, Volkov's voice rang out, taunting them. "Ramirez. You can't run forever. This is your end." Jace didn't respond, focusing instead on reaching the rooftop. As they burst through the final door, they found themselves standing on the edge of the building, the city stretching out before them, its lights dim beneath the stormy sky. A helicopter hovered overhead, its spotlight cutting through the rain and illuminating the rooftop. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but Jace knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Volkov appeared in the doorway, his gun trained on Jace, a cold smile twisting his lips. "This is where it ends, Ramirez. You should have stayed dead the first time." Jace felt Harris tense beside him, but he held his ground, staring Volkov down. "You've taken a lot from me, Volkov. But you won't walk away from this." Volkov's smile widened. Bold words from a man who's about to die. But before he could pull the trigger, the sound of a gunshot filled the air. Harris staggered, clutching his chest as he fell to the ground, his eyes wide with. Connor Kane was the best in the business, a shadow operative who specialized in high-risk extractions and intel recovery. After 2 decades of slipping through the cracks of geopolitics and black market alliances, he was ready to leave it all behind. His last mission had been a success, the perfect exit for a man who had seen too much. But just as he was settling into his new life in Lisbon, the past came knocking. One night, Kane found a manila envelope slipped under his apartment door. It contained a single photograph, a faded image of him in Sarajevo, taken nearly 10 years earlier during a covert mission that had gone sideways. That mission was buried under layers of classified files, inaccessible to anyone who wasn't there. Yet here it was, sitting on his doorstep. Beneath it was a handwritten note in code, "Return to Sarajevo. The game is unfinished." That mission, 10 years ago, had been one of the most brutal of his career. His team had been tasked with taking down a Serbian warlord suspected of orchestrating underground arms deals with a mysterious syndicate known as the Revenant Order. But things had gone south, and his entire team had been compromised, barely making it out alive. Kane had always suspected there was more to the mission, something hidden beneath layers of misdirection. He knew that going back to Sarajevo meant opening up a past he had worked hard to bury. Yet he couldn't ignore the feeling that someone wanted him back there for a reason. So, Kane gathered his old equipment, leaving no trace of his departure, and flew out under an alias, slipping through borders as he'd done countless times before. He arrived in Sarajevo at dusk, the city's scars from years of conflict still visible against the skyline, reminders of old wars and unresolved secrets. Almost immediately, Kane sensed he was being watched. Shadows lurked in alleys, eyes followed him in reflective surfaces, and small, seemingly harmless encounters felt charged with hidden meanings. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he was ready for it. Years of honing his instincts kicked in as he prepared for whatever lay ahead. His first stop was an old cafe, a place he and his team had used as a safe house years ago. As he slipped into a corner booth, a waitress slid him a cup of coffee along with a folded note. He glanced at it. "Meet me at the ruins. Midnight. Alone." The signature was unmistakable, Sofia Markovic, his handler from that ill-fated mission. Sofia had disappeared shortly after the operation, and no one had seen her since. Rumor had it she'd gone rogue, or worse, been taken out by the Revenant Order. If she was alive, she was his best chance to find answers. At midnight, Kane made his way to the ruins of an old fortress on the outskirts of the city. The silence was thick, the only sound being his own footsteps echoing across the stone. In the moonlight, he saw a shadow move, and a woman stepped into the faint light, Sofia, older but still sharp, her eyes colder than he remembered. "Kane," she said, her voice steady. "You shouldn't have come back." "You called me here, Sofia," he replied, his tone measured. "I want answers. What happened that night? Why was my team sacrificed?" Sofia looked away, her jaw tightening. "Because we were all pawns. The Revenant Order had agents everywhere. They'd infiltrated high-ranking government agencies, military, intelligence networks, all of it. That mission in Sarajevo was never about stopping the arms trade. It was about eliminating anyone who got too close to uncovering the Order's real agenda. And that was?" Kane pressed, a chill running down his spine. "They were developing a weapon, a device that could disrupt all digital and communication systems within a 100-mile radius. They called it the Eclipse. Imagine the power to shut down an entire country's infrastructure in seconds. That's what they were after." Kane's mind raced. He'd heard whispers of the Eclipse, a rumored weapon that could change the balance of global power. But he'd assumed it was just that, a rumor. Now, it seemed terrifyingly real. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Sophia hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Because they've found a way to activate it. They're going to use it as leverage, and if they succeed, they'll control every government that relies on modern tech. I managed to steal part of the activation code. That's why they're hunting me. And you." She handed him a flash drive. "This is only part of it. The other half is hidden in the city, and they're closing in on it." Before Kane could respond, the faint hum of approaching vehicles interrupted them. The ruins were suddenly flooded with headlights, and figures emerged from the darkness, Revenant agents, dressed in black tactical gear, weapons aimed at them. The trap had been sprung. "Kane, go!" Sophia yelled, drawing her gun and firing off shots to cover his escape. Without hesitation, Kane bolted, sprinting through the labyrinth of ruins as bullets whizzed past him, cutting through the night. He knew he had to disappear. The Revenant Order was too powerful to confront head-on, and if he wanted to survive, he had to outsmart them. He found an old tunnel that led to the edge of the city and slipped into the shadows, disappearing into Sarajevo's winding streets. He knew the city well enough to evade capture, but he was only a step ahead. He spent the next few days moving like a ghost, blending into the city's underbelly, reaching out to old contacts, and piecing together clues to locate the hidden half of the activation code. Meanwhile, he kept his senses sharp, always aware of the agents patrolling nearby. The Revenant Order had eyes everywhere, and each night he found himself forced to relocate, narrowly escaping their grasp. After days of searching, Kane found himself at a forgotten bunker beneath the city's old library. It was abandoned, dark, and silent, with walls covered in encrypted symbols. His contact had said this was where Sophia had hidden the second half of the code. Using a flashlight, Kane deciphered the symbols, each one a part of a larger puzzle that eventually led him to a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, he found a small, dusty USB drive, the missing piece. Just as he pocketed the drive, he heard footsteps approaching. The Order's agents had tracked him down. Kane knew he had no time to waste. In a calculated move, he disabled the lights, plunging the bunker into darkness. He navigated through the shadows, silently taking down one agent after another. The firefight was short and brutal, leaving him breathless but alive. With both parts of the code, Kane had what he needed to stop the eclipse. But he also knew that simply possessing it made him a marked man. He had one final move to make, to broadcast the code, rendering it useless by putting it in the public domain. But to do that, he'd need the help of a skilled hacker. Kane reached out to Sophia, arranging a covert meeting in a high-rise safe house overlooking the city. The skyline was blanketed in fog, lights muted and casting eerie glows across the dark buildings. Sophia greeted him with a grim smile, and together, they connected the drive to her laptop, preparing to transmit the code. As they worked, they heard the sound of helicopters approaching. Revenant forces had tracked them again, and this time, they were bringing everything they had. Time was running out. "Just a few more seconds," Sophia said, her fingers flying over the keys. The door exploded inward, and Kane sprang into action, taking down agents as they stormed in, fighting to buy her more time. Finally, she hit enter, and the data began flooding the network, transmitting the Eclipse code to every secure channel in existence. The Revenant Order's most valuable weapon was now public knowledge, useless in the hands of any single party. In the chaos, Sophia and Kane managed to slip out, escaping into the maze of alleys below. As they watched the city's lights fade into the distance, Kane knew he had narrowly escaped with his life. The Order would still hunt him, but they had lost their greatest leverage. For now, the world was safe. As dawn broke over Sarajevo, Kane vanished once more, a ghost on the move, carrying with him the secrets of a war that would never make the headlines. Alex Mercer was a man who left his past behind, or so he thought. 5 years out of the game, he had finally built a quiet life in a small town nestled by the mountains, far from the chaos of his old life as an elite Black Ops specialist. But that peace shattered the day he found an unmarked package on his doorstep. Inside was a simple message: "We remember." The words were written in code, familiar to Alex from his days in covert operations. The memory of his last mission flooded back: the disastrous op in Madrid, a political scandal that almost toppled governments and forced his agency to erase his identity. They'd buried it all to protect him. But someone was digging it up. Overnight, his life turned upside down. His secure phone vibrated with coded messages. His contacts from the old days, people he hadn't heard from in years, were going dark, disappearing one by one. Someone was systematically hunting them down, and Alex was clearly next. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he packed his bags, locking his memories and his weapons away, and hit the road. Every move he made felt like walking a razor's edge. He quickly realized he was dealing with an unknown enemy, a ghostly presence that left no clues but always seemed one step ahead. The deeper he dug, the more he found himself entangled in a secret war involving high-ranking officials, covert technology, and millions of dollars in hidden funds. It was a vendetta that had been brewing since that mission in Madrid, and now, the stakes were higher than ever. His investigation led him to Berlin, where he met an old friend, Natasha, a hacker and former intelligence agent. She had a theory, that whoever was targeting him was after something bigger, the Harbinger Protocol, a classified project that Alex had only heard whispers of. Said to be a cyberweapon capable of disabling entire infrastructures, it was designed as a last resort in global warfare. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could cripple cities, entire countries. Natasha hacked into restricted networks, retrieving files and piecing together the web of connections. Together, they uncovered clues linking government officials, private arms dealers, and rogue military officers, all tied to a shadow organization known as the Black Mantle. But before they could act, Natasha's systems were hacked, her hard drive wiped clean. An ominous message flashed across her screen: "We're watching." Without wasting a second, Alex knew it was time to move. He and Natasha went off the grid, switching vehicles, abandoning phones, and using analog methods to communicate. They were playing a high-stakes game against an invisible, lethal opponent who knew how to leverage every digital trace. The chase took them across Europe, from abandoned bunkers in the Alps to safe houses in old cities, each place hiding encrypted files and dead drops left by the operatives who had come before them. As they unraveled the puzzle, Alex discovered that the Black Mantle had been orchestrating his betrayal from the start. They were behind the botched Madrid operation, the loose ends, the abandoned agents. The Harbinger Protocol was not only real, it was the last piece they needed for a global takeover. And now, they knew Alex was onto them. A final message came through, forcing their hand: "Meet us in Prague." Alone. Alex knew it was a trap, but it was his only chance to stop them. With Natasha providing cover from a distance, he arrived at the rendezvous in an abandoned cathedral under the cover of night, his senses on high alert. Shadows moved around him, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing across the cold stone floor. His old handler, a man he hadn't seen since the Madrid disaster, stepped out of the darkness. "Alex," he said with a slight smile. "I was hoping you'd show." Behind him stood a dozen operatives, each armed, each with eyes locked on him. They'd been waiting, knowing that Alex's loyalty to the truth would lead him here. "What's the protocol's endgame?" Alex demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. His handler's smile only widened. "Control, Alex. The kind we were always meant to have. Your little crusade ends here." But Alex had prepared for this. In a calculated move, he triggered a signal to Natasha, who had hacked into the building's power grid. With a single keystroke, the lights went out, and in the cover of darkness, Alex moved. Years of training took over as he disarmed and disabled one operative after another, using the shadows to his advantage. By the time the backup power kicked in, the room was littered with bodies, and Alex stood alone, his handler held at gunpoint. "It's over," Alex said, his voice steady. "You don't understand," the handler whispered, defiance in his eyes. "You can't kill an idea. Black Mantle isn't just me. It's everywhere." Without another word, Alex pulled the trigger. There would be time to deal with the Black Mantle's network later. For now, he had bought the world a few precious moments of peace. As dawn broke over the Prague skyline, Alex disappeared into the crowd, a ghost once more, but this time, he was the one with the upper hand. Ethan Cross had never seen his life flash before his eyes so many times in a single night. His pulse hammered as he raced down the narrow, dimly lit street in the back alleys of Belgrade, his heart thudding against his ribs. He didn't know who they were, or why they'd been following him for the past 2 days, but one thing was certain, they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and from the look in their eyes, what they wanted was his head. It started as a regular intel gathering mission. Ethan was a covert operative, highly trained and deadly, with years of experience navigating complex international operations. He'd been tasked with gathering information about an underground weapons cartel that had been moving large quantities of advanced arms technology through Eastern Europe. The briefing was standard, the target clear. But he hadn't expected a shadow operation to tail him as he moved in to meet his contact at the crumbling warehouse by the Danube. Now, all that was left was the adrenaline pounding through his veins and the fear crawling up his spine as his instincts screamed for him to run. Every corner he turned only led to more dead ends. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about tonight was different. His gut told him he was dealing with pros. These people weren't just mercenaries or hired muscle, they were trained, precise, ruthless. Ethan's footsteps echoed on the cobbled pavement as he darted past an old market, now dark and empty, its heavy iron gates rattling in the cold midnight breeze. The only sound was the faint patter of rain, mingling with the distant roar of the river. But he knew better than to assume he was alone. A flash of movement at the edge of his vision made him spin, just in time to dodge a silent knife swipe aimed at his throat. The attacker's face was masked, his eyes a steely blue that held no mercy. Ethan countered, blocking the second strike and twisting the assailant's arm with practiced ease. But before he could finish him off, a gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the metal container beside him. He rolled away, taking cover behind a stack of old crates. They were closing in. He quickly scanned the area, calculating his next move. The shadows moved with silent purpose, the trained footfalls of multiple operatives approaching from every direction. Whoever they were, they had the manpower and firepower to surround him easily. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and, judging by the subtle clicks and murmurs over their radios, up against a highly synchronized team. He had seconds to act, and the consequences of staying here too long were a bullet in the head or worse. With a flash of desperate inspiration, he grabbed a metal pipe lying nearby and hurled it across the alley, hitting a stack of crates with a loud clang. His attackers shifted their focus, moving towards the noise. It was all the distraction he needed. He sprinted towards the fence at the far end of the alley, jumped, and scrambled over the top, cutting his hands on the rusted barbed wire. The pain was sharp, grounding him, but he had no time to dwell on it. He dropped down on the other side, his feet hitting the ground just as the sound of boots grew louder behind him. Ethan didn't stop. The only chance he had now was to lose them in the winding streets and alleys of the old city. His mind raced as he calculated his next steps. He had to get to a secure line, contact his agency, and figure out who these people were. The intel he was carrying was highly sensitive, blueprints for a new biochemical weapon that a terrorist cell was attempting to develop. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could mean mass casualties across Europe. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt a shiver of fear crawl up his spine. The files he was carrying weren't just any ordinary intelligence, they were the kind that could destabilize governments, the kind that powerful figures in the shadows would kill to possess. He navigated the maze of Belgrade's old streets, taking every turn he could, hoping to lose his pursuers. But the sounds of footsteps grew closer. He ducked into an old, abandoned building, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The air was thick with dust and decay, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the walls. He pressed himself against the wall, controlling his breathing, listening. Outside, the footsteps slowed, methodical, as if they knew he was nearby. Ethan slid his hand to his belt, where he kept his backup Glock. It wasn't much against an entire squad, but it would have to do. He raised it, ready to fire at the first sign of movement. The seconds ticked by, stretching into a tense eternity. Then he heard it, a faint scrape of a boot against concrete, just outside the doorway. He held his breath, finger on the trigger, waiting. The figure entered, gun raised, scanning the shadows. He was one of the same men who'd attacked him earlier. Ethan could see the glint of a knife strapped to his hip, the silent, lethal calm in his eyes. This wasn't an ordinary operative, he was a hunter, and Ethan was his prey. Ethan moved in a blur. He swung his elbow up, catching the man off guard, the gunshot muffled as they struggled. The attacker's reflexes were quick, but Ethan was quicker. In a flash, he had him in a chokehold, cutting off his air. He needed answers, and this was his only chance to get them. "Who sent you?" Ethan growled, tightening his grip. The man's expression remained stoic, his loyalty unwavering. It was clear that he'd rather die than betray his employer. But Ethan had other ways of making him talk. He twisted the man's arm at a brutal angle, eliciting a grimace of pain. "The files. Why are you after them?" The man sneered, his voice a low rasp. "You'll never get out of here alive, Cross. We own this city." Before Ethan could press him further, the man slammed his head back, hitting Ethan in the face and breaking free. He stumbled, blood dripping from his nose, and the attacker took advantage, lunging forward with the knife. Ethan barely dodged, the blade slicing his arm. Ignoring the pain, he twisted, delivering a crushing blow to the man's jaw, knocking him out cold. But the noise had attracted attention. Outside, he could hear the rest of the squad closing in. He had only moments before they found him. Ethan searched the unconscious man's pockets, finding a small, encrypted device. He pocketed it, hoping it would hold the clues he needed. Then, without a second thought, he darted towards the back exit, slipping out into the rain. Belgrade stretched out before him, silent and dark, the city lights flickering like distant stars. He knew he couldn't run forever, but if he was going to survive the night, he'd need to stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting him. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, and the streets gleamed under the dim glow of scattered street lamps. Ethan knew Belgrade well enough to navigate through its labyrinthine streets, but he was running out of time. His attackers weren't just efficient, they were relentless, and from the glimpses he'd caught, well-equipped. These weren't amateurs, they were a highly coordinated tactical team, trained to execute quickly, quietly, and with deadly precision. As Ethan continued down the narrow alleyways, he fought to suppress the growing urgency pressing against his chest. He was used to high-stakes operations, but this mission was different. He hadn't expected to be ambushed, and definitely not by a private team with such sophisticated weaponry. Whoever had hired them had deep pockets and even deeper connections. He mentally cursed as he realized he should have noticed the signs earlier, the near-silent drones shadowing his movements, the subtle changes in local foot traffic around his safe houses. He'd been careless, and now he was paying for it. Ducking into the shelter of a crumbling brick archway, Ethan took a moment to examine the device he'd snatched from his would-be attacker. The screen remained blank, requiring an activation code. He recognized it immediately as an encrypted communication tool, used by high-ranking operatives to relay real-time instructions without risking interception. If he could get it online, it might give him an edge in staying ahead of them. But before he could even consider trying to hack into it, he heard the telltale murmur of voices approaching, punctuated by the faint hum of an engine. A sleek black SUV rolled down the street, its headlights off, moving as silently as a predator in the night. A flash of lightning revealed the silhouettes of 3 men with military-grade rifles, scanning the area with night vision goggles. They weren't leaving anything to chance. Ethan pressed himself flat against the damp wall, watching as the vehicle rolled to a stop. His options were dwindling. He could keep running, trying to stay one step ahead, or take a calculated risk. In his line of work, hesitation was fatal. The SUV's doors opened, and the men stepped out, their boots hitting the pavement in perfect synchrony. 2 of them moved forward, their weapons at the ready, while the third lingered by the car, speaking softly into a radio. The comms crackled faintly in the damp air, and Ethan caught fragments of their conversation. Sector 4 clear, moving to sweep Sector 5, primary target possibly injured, no sighting since last location. As they spread out, Ethan seized the opportunity. He moved with lethal efficiency, coming up behind the man by the car and pressing a knife to his throat, covering his mouth before he could utter a sound. The man tensed, his hands dropping the radio, but Ethan's grip was unyielding. In seconds, he lowered the man's unconscious body to the ground, dragging him out of sight behind the SUV. 1 down, but 2 others remained. Ethan scoured the man's belt and pocketed an additional clip for his Glock. He then retrieved the man's earpiece, carefully fitting it into his own ear. Immediately, the low hum of communication flowed into his ear, punctuated by orders from someone on the other end. Sector 5, maintain visuals. We need confirmation on Cross's location. His suspicions were confirmed, they knew exactly who he was. And if they were tracking his location, it wouldn't be long before they brought in backup. Ethan edged closer to the 2 remaining operatives, moving from shadow to shadow, his footsteps silent against the wet cobblestone. These men were armed and alert, but they lacked the instincts that only years in the field could hone. He waited until one of them turned, scanning an alleyway, then took his shot. The silenced gunfire barely registered as he dropped the first man. Before the second one could react, Ethan had him on the ground, delivering a quick, decisive blow to the back of his neck. He allowed himself a brief moment to catch his breath, wiping the rain from his eyes. But he knew better than to stay too long. Every passing minute brought him closer to being cornered. As he slipped down another alley, his mind raced back to his briefing 2 days earlier. His mission had been clear: extract intelligence on Dragan Vukovic, an arms dealer with ties to a shadowy syndicate known only as Cryos. Cryos was infamous for its influence, operating in the gray areas of geopolitics, supplying arms and intelligence to the highest bidders without regard for ethics or loyalty. But lately, Cryos had shown interest in biological weaponry, a game-changer in the world of covert warfare. Ethan hadn't anticipated that Cryos would catch on to his investigation so quickly. From what his agency knew, Vukovic was involved in trafficking a new kind of neurotoxin, a chemical agent deadly enough to destabilize an entire city within hours. The thought of that weapon falling into the wrong hands was enough to keep him moving, no matter how bleak his chances appeared. Emerging onto a broader street, Ethan kept his gaze low, blending in with the sparse, late-night crowd that wandered the city. He scanned the area for potential hideouts. A flickering neon sign for a dingy nightclub caught his eye. It would be crowded, loud, and chaotic, exactly the sort of place he could lose himself, if only briefly. He slipped inside, the thump of bass and the chaotic swirl of lights engulfing him. The strobe lights and flashing reds cast shadows across the dimly lit bar and crowded dance floor. The mix of drunken tourists and locals gave him enough cover as he weaved his way to the far side of the club, finding an exit near the bathrooms. In a small, dim hallway by the back door, Ethan found a quiet corner and tried to catch his breath, listening to the muffled beats of the music. He pulled out the encrypted device he'd stolen and inspected it closely. It was a custom model, made by a manufacturer known for creating secure devices for government agencies. If he could find a way to hack into it, he might be able to intercept the orders coming down to the operatives chasing him. He activated a secure link through his smartwatch, attempting a bypass code sequence. The device blinked red, denying access, but he persisted. He knew a trick or two to crack low-level encryption, a perk of working in intelligence for so long. After a few tries, the screen finally flickered to life, and text scrolled across it. Primary target, Cross. Objective, retrieval of intelligence and elimination if necessary. Full discretion advised. Reinforcements en route. Reinforcements. He clenched his jaw, feeling the tension tightening like a vice. There would be no way out if they managed to surround him completely. As he continued scrolling, he noticed the signature at the bottom of the order, Cryo's command, Operative Level 9 authorization. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This wasn't just any team after him, it was Cryos' elite. Level 9 authorization was rarely granted, reserved only for the highest priority missions, those that couldn't fail. Whoever had issued this order was sending a message loud and clear. Ethan Cross was considered a top-tier threat, and they would stop at nothing to neutralize him. A door swung open, and he tensed, shoving the device back into his pocket as a figure appeared, silhouetted by the hallway's faint light. He recognized her immediately, the woman from the briefing. Her name was Zara Talik, a field operative rumored to be one of the deadliest agents in the region. They'd crossed paths once before in Istanbul, but she'd been on his side then. The look in her eyes told him that wasn't the case tonight. "Ethan," she said, her voice low and unreadable. She tilted her head slightly, observing him with a mixture of pity and regret. "You should have stayed out of this." "You don't know what they're planning," he replied, careful to keep his hands visible and his voice calm. "If they get their hands on that neurotoxin, thousands could die. This isn't just another deal gone wrong, Zara." She regarded him in silence, her expression flickering briefly with something he couldn't read. For a moment, he thought he saw doubt, maybe even sympathy. But she shook her head, her eyes hardening. "It's bigger than both of us, Ethan. They have orders, and we're both just pawns." Without warning, she raised her weapon. Ethan reacted instantly, twisting to avoid the shot, the bullet slamming into the wall behind him. The club's pulsing music drowned out the sound, and no one seemed to notice the skirmish unfolding in the shadows. Ethan lunged forward, disarming her in a swift motion, but she countered with a knee to his ribs, sending him staggering. They grappled, exchanging blows in a brutal, silent dance, each movement calculated, each attack intended to kill. She was good, faster and stronger than he remembered. But he wasn't about to back down. With a quick feint, he grabbed her arm and twisted, pinning her against the wall. "I'm not your enemy, Zara," he whispered fiercely. "Help me stop this before it's too late." She looked up at him, her breathing ragged, her face inches from his. For a split second, he saw something shift in her expression. But before she could respond, the device in his pocket buzzed, and he glanced down, his heart sinking as he read the new message. Final clearance issued. Reinforce with full squad at location. Zara's eyes widened slightly as she read over his shoulder.